So Bernard will present for us the article, and he has prepared some questions for us, and we will start the discussion after that, okay? So let's give the chance for him to explain for us. Are you ready, Bernard?
Yeah.
Okay.
So guys, the name of my presentation is called, or the name of the article, I'll say, is called Air Augmentation, an Immersive Virtual Reality for Bimanual Upper Limb Rehabilitation in Individuals with and Without Hemiplegic Cerebral Palsy. Yeah, so we'll get into it. So to kind of begin with, to perform a bimanual task, you have to excite a little bit more cortical networks while encouraging cross-hemispheric activity and cortical reorganization when compared to unimanual tasks. So basically what that means is it's a little bit more difficult to do a bimanual reaching task rather than doing just a single arm reaching task. And as bimanual tasks are especially important for people in the people who have hemiplegia cerebral palsy due to their asymmetries in motor execution, right? And so this is where having a mirror comparison during bimanual activities could, improve their proprioception or just knowing where their arms are in space. And so using a virtual reality game like a VR game to mimic this limits that cognitive load. It limits them having to really think about where their arms are in space, and they could just do it. And that hopefully translates to their actual physical movement in real life, and then also in their activities of daily living. And so what this article kind of centers around is this idea of error augmentation, or what I'll kind of call EA throughout the presentation. Essentially what it does, it kind of adjusts feedback error based on rehabilitative settings. And so people with neuromotor disabilities, they might not be as sensitive to these small errors that they have in their symmetry. So EA will make those errors like a little bit more noticeable, causing that participant or the patient to have a greater corrective response, having them to have to reach farther than what they actually need to because of what they see through error augmentation. And so the objectives of the study are pretty simple. They kind of just had three main ones, and the first one was to kind of explore the viability of manipulating the visual feedback of an IVR environment during bimanual movements and how that can be implemented into the home rehabilitative setting. They also wanted to test the effectiveness of visual error augmentation, where the asymmetry of upper limbs for a typically developing group was manipulated, which is kind of what I'll talk about in a bit, during a bilateral forward reach. And then they also wanted to test the effectiveness of error augmentation training for children with cerebral palsy. So the study design is pretty similar to how we do our virtual or our IVR studies. They just had 17 participants, 12 who are in the typically developing group, and then 5 cerebral palsy group. They used the Oculus Rift, and then they also had the participants seated in a 2x2 play space. And what they had the participants do is that they were asked to perform a reaching task where they reached out to interact with an object that simulated a food preparation. So they reached out to grab a hot dog with both hands and then use both hands to put the hot dog into a hot dog bun. And their end goal was basically customized by measuring the participant's baseline max reach distance. So if the participants' max reach distance was pretty far, they made the challenge. They made it a little bit more challenging for them to put the hot dog in the hot dog bun. So they made those objects a little bit farther for them. Whereas if their max reach was a little bit shorter, they put the hot dog bun a little closer to them, so where they can have a little bit easier of a reach. So they use error augmentation. The way they use error augmentation is to visually amplify the symmetrical error between the non-dominant affected side for the cerebral palsy group and then a dominant and less affected side. And so they did this by a factor of 2. So what this means is that if their non-dominant hand was in reality 2 centimeters behind their dominant hand, in the game, it looked like their hands were 4 centimeters apart. Where in reality, like I said, like their hands were in reality 2 centimeters apart. And so this kind of forced the participants to reach farther than necessary to produce visual symmetry in the game, but not actually symmetry in real life. Another thing they did was the typically developing group, they tested them with a scale asymmetry factor of 70% of their full reach on their non-dominant side. And so the reason they did that was to kind of simulate that acquired asymmetry of the cerebral palsy participants. And so this right here is just a picture of the game. The left kind of just shows the um, the picture of like what the participants saw when their hands were visually symmetrical, or on the right, this is what they saw when their hands were not visually symmetrical or asymmetrical. This white dot here kind of shows the true error or where their hands were in reality. But the orange line kind of shows that error augmentation, how that affected what they actually saw in the game. So of course, the error augmentation, their hands looked a little bit farther apart than in reality. And so a little bit more on the study design and methods. They decided to do a single session experiment with the participants randomized to begin training either with or without error augmentation in the first set. They did 5 baseline trials and 5 evaluation trials. Then they went on to do 60 training trials in between the baseline and evaluation trials, and that was broken down to 4 sets of 15, with a break between each mini set. And then at the end of the training, they did a 15 washout 15 washout trials. And they did a 5-minute break between each training set. And then the way they measured symmetry was with root mean squared error. And they also did the washout trials and the baseline trials without error augmentation for the cerebral palsy group. And they also did the washout and the baseline trials without the 70% asymmetry in a non-dominant hand for the typically developing group. And so this right here is kind of like a picture, if it helps you see it more visually, of what the study design looked like. Like I said, they had the 5 baseline trials. They went and did whatever training that they were assigned to, and then they did the evaluation, the washout, and then the 5-minute break, and then they switched to the training that they didn't do for the first set. So the results were kind of, I feel like, what you thought would happen. They kind of split them up into talking about it with a typically developing group and then also with the CP group. For the typically developing group, they saw that after training without EA, the participants were not able to return to baseline asymmetrical reach, whereas when training with EA, the participants performed with significantly lower error when comparing evaluation and baseline trials. So we'll look at this graph here. So this left graph shows the average symmetry between participants during the baseline training and evaluation trial. So the baseline is going to be low because this is without error augmentation, without the 70% asymmetrical factor. So it's kind of like their max reach essentially, and where their arms come down, or how symmetrical their arms just off their max reach. And then you go to the training, of course, it's going to be a little bit higher as they get used to whatever training that they're doing with that 70% asymmetrical reach, or just getting used to error augmentation. And then you kind of see the difference here in evaluation. The orange line, of course, being the error augmentation. You kind of see where they are able to get back close to baseline when they're training with error augmentation, but when training without error augmentation, they're a little bit higher than baseline when it comes to being able to determine their symmetrical error. On the right, it's kind of just broken down. It's kind of a little bit of the same graph, but they just kind of break it down between each participants, or all the 12 participants. So on the left, when training without EA, you see that the symmetry error most people's symmetry error increases when training without EA, but when training with EA, most of them are able to get back to baseline, or even some of them are even able to improve on their symmetry. And we'll go back to talk about the CP group. For the cerebral palsy group, all 5 participants reached with lower symmetry error after training with error augmentation than without it. And we'll go to their graphs. So on the left, it shows them training without EA. Not all participants were able to improve on their symmetry. Only one was able to really improve significantly, and that's participant CP5. He was able to improve significantly, but when you look at them training with error augmentation, everybody was able to improve on their symmetrical or their bimanual symmetrical reach compared to without error augmentation. And so getting into like kind of like what I got from this, and we'll kind of discuss it a little bit, is essentially is that this kind of just good initial positive evidence for the use of IVR to promote bimanual symmetry in those with cerebral palsy, and that error augmentation allows for patients to increase their symmetry more when compared to a normal bilateral reaching pattern. And then lastly is that individuals, something that they also found too, which I thought was pretty interesting, was that individuals with a greater difference in upper limb symmetry benefit more from visual error augmentation. And the way they found this out was before they had any of the cerebral palsy participants do any of the training or do any type of training or participate in any of the sets. They found a little bit more information on them by conducting the bimanual fine motor functioning test. And essentially, it's just a functionality test to see how well these cerebral palsy participants were able to kind of move their upper arms, how well they're able to use their upper arms in functional tasks. So basically, what they found was that the participant with the highest bimanual ability improved the least, while the one with the lowest improved the most. And we kind of can go back to this graph and see that. So you can look at like participant CP3 on the right in the right graph. He has already a low baseline for his symmetrical error, whereas someone he improves like not as much. But you can see somebody who like participant CP5, he has a higher baseline error and he improves a lot compared to CP3 on decreasing his asymmetry. And so what this kind of tells you is that there could be a certain bimanual functioning level of participants that could see more improvements than another. But I'll kind of get into the next slides that because that smaller sample size, they do need to do a little bit more research to kind of confirm this data. And so, yeah, I'll just get into a little bit of limitations right now. So I'll jump to the small sample size first. So being that it's a small sample size, there only are 5 cerebral palsy participants. They couldn't statistically conclude the effectiveness of the study, which is interesting. I think the reason why they had the typically developing group have that 70% asymmetrical reach was not only was they because they needed a control group, but also it was kind of to hide the fact they had like a smaller sample size. And we kind of like we're talking about like how hard it is to kind of recruit cerebral palsy participants. So I think the reason they had that typically developing group, like I said, was to kind of hide the fact and use that asymmetrical 70% asymmetrical reach as like, oh, here we have a couple more. This is what cerebral palsy would look like, or people with cerebral palsy, this is how they would benefit from using virtual reality to improve their bimanual reach. So that's one. The second one is there could be difficulty in setting up the VR independently. So after the study, they had each cerebral palsy participant do a survey on how well they thought the software and the tool could be used. And basically, the consensus was they all thought it was very useful. They all thought it was good and could be very effective in them in their rehabilitation. But they thought it would be difficult in being able to set it up independently, which could prove to be difficult to use in a home setting for rehabilitation, which was one of their objectives. Which was one of their objectives of the study was to determine if that this was a viable source to use in a home rehabilitative setting. And then lastly, the last thing was that there could be limited retention of motor adaptation with this study. Because the study was so short, they only did a single session. So a different study could be conducted where the washout period could be a little longer. It could be over a couple of days. The training could also last over a couple of days. You can see that retention or of motor adaptation occur, and then hopefully eventual learning will occur over that period of time. So yeah, I think that this is a good study, but just because that small sample size and how short the training was, the data, I think the data is good. It's just that a little bit more has to be done to kind of really confirm that this is a viable source to be used to really improve people with cerebral palsy, hemiplegic cerebral palsy, improve their bimanual reach symmetry. So yeah, that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions outright about anything that they heard me say or anything that they thought was interesting from the paper?
Good job, Bernard. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, it's open for questions.